who knew how to read a battlefield in seconds. Marcus Fenix had been fighting wars for most of his adult life. He had seen cities fall, friends die, entire worlds consumed by enemies that should not exist. He had fought against impossible odds so many times that desperation had become a baseline rather than an exception. The Locust Horde had taught him that humanity's survival was never guaranteed, that every victory was temporary, that every moment of peace was just the intermission before the next war. He had lost count of the battles, lost count of the friends buried under rubble or torn apart by creatures that crawled up from the depths. He had learned to compartmentalize grief, to keep moving forward even when forward meant nothing more than surviving another hour. But this was not Sierra. The sky was wrong. The gravity felt different, heavier, as though the planet itself resented his presence. The air tasted of chemicals and corruption that his armor's filters struggled to process. And in the distance, beyond the curtain of smoke and falling ash, he could hear the roar of something vast and bestial, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. He checked his weapon by instinct. The Mark II Lancer assault rifle was still mag-locked to his back, its weight reassuring even after the violent descent. He pulled it free, the chainsaw bayonet gleaming dully in the half-light. The weapon had killed thousands. Grubs, drones, boomers, things with names he had tried to forget. It had never failed him. The magazine was full, the chamber clear, the blade's teeth sharp enough to bite through chitin and bone. He chambered around with practiced efficiency, the sound lost beneath the distant thunder of artillery. Something moved in the smoke ahead. Marcus dropped to a crouch, weapon raised, targeting reticle tracking movement through the haze. His HUD flickered, struggling to adapt to atmospheric conditions it had never been designed to interpret. Thermal imaging painted ghosts across his vision. Motion sensors pinged returns that made no sense. Biological signatures too massive to be human, too numerous to be anything but an army. The shapes resolved into figures. Human figures, shambling forward through the mud with weapons held at awkward angles. They wore uniforms that looked centuries out of date, greatcoats and steel helmets, gas masks and armor plates bolted over flak vests. They moved with the exhausted determination of men who had been fighting for too long, their formation loose but functional. Behind them, something burned, sending oily smoke curling into the sky. One of them raised a hand, shouting something in a language Marcus did not recognize. The words were harsh, guttural, inflected with sounds that seemed designed to carry over the roar of battle. The soldier's mask reflected firelight, twin lenses staring at Marcus like the eyes of a mechanical insect. Others joined him, spreading out into a half circle, weapons not quite aimed but ready. They were cautious, smart. They had seen too many things crawl out of drop pods that were not friendly. Marcus lowered his rifle slightly, keeping it ready but not threatening. The lead soldier stepped closer, mud sucking at his boots. He was shorter than Marcus by a head, his uniform bearing insignia that meant nothing but suggested rank. A sash of crimson cloth hung from his shoulder, and on his belt hung a pistol that looked oversized for the man's frame. When he spoke again, his voice was muffled by the mask, but the tone was clear enough. A question. A demand for identification. Marcus keyed his external speakers, his voice emerging rough and flat through the armor's voxcasters. Sergeant Marcus Fenix, Coalition of Ordered Government's Armed Forces. Who the hell are you? The masked soldier cocked his head, then turned to one of his companions and spoke rapidly. The second soldier pulled out a device that looked like a voxcaster crossed with religious iconography, speaking into it in clipped tones. The response came back as static and broken Gothic, a language that Marcus's translator suite struggled to parse before offering fragmented approximations. Astra Militarum, Imperial Guard, Hellsreach Minor, Orc Incursion. None of those words meant anything to Marcus, but the tone conveyed enough. He was in the middle of someone else's war. Before he could respond, the air itself seemed to shudder. A sound rose from beyond the smoke, a roar that was less voice and more force of nature, a bellowing cacophony that drove itself into the skull like nails. The guardsmen snapped to attention, weapons rising as one, their exhaustion falling away in the face of pure survival instinct. The lead soldier shouted orders, his voice cutting through the noise, and the men began falling back toward their trenches with practiced speed. Marcus saw it a heartbeat later. The smoke parted like a curtain torn aside by a giant's hand, and through the gap charged something that defied rational description. It was massive, easily 3 meters tall, its body a slab of muscle and scar tissue barely contained by crude armor plates, bolted directly into green flesh. Its jaw jutted forward, lined with tusks the size of combat knives. In its hands, it carried a weapon that looked like someone had welded 3 machine guns together and attached a fuel tank with zero regard for safety or sanity. The thing's eyes burned with a manic glee, and as it charged, it opened its mouth and screamed, "Wah!" Behind it, the smoke disgorged dozens more. Orcs. That was the word Marcus's translator offered, though it seemed inadequate for the reality of what he was seeing. They were a green tide of muscle and violence, each one a walking engine of destruction wrapped in scrap metal and fury. They charged with no formation, no tactics beyond forward momentum and overwhelming aggression. Some fired their weapons as they ran, bullets spraying in wild arcs that cut down their own as often as they threatened the enemy. Others simply bellowed and waved massive blades or clubs, eager to close the distance and tear into flesh with their bare hands. The guardsmen opened fire. Las fire lit up the smoke, crimson beams lancing through the haze to punch smoking holes through green flesh. The orcs staggered but did not fall. Some kept running even with fist-sized wounds burned clean through their torsos. Others stumbled, recovered, and charged again with even greater fury. The guardsmen's discipline held, their volleys coordinated, but Marcus could see immediately that they were outmatched. The enemy had numbers, mass, and a complete disregard for casualties that turned them into a living avalanche. Marcus made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He opened fire. The lancer roared, its muzzle flash strobing through the smoke as armor-piercing rounds tore into the orc charge. Marcus walked his fire across the front line, each burst controlled and precise. Headshots where possible, center mass when not. The weapon's kick was familiar, comforting, and he compensated automatically as he burned through half a magazine in seconds. Orcs fell, their bodies tumbling into the mud, tripping those behind them. It created a momentary gap, a hesitation in the charge that gave the guardsmen precious seconds to adjust their line. The lead guardsman shouted something that might have been gratitude or simply tactical coordination. Marcus did not wait for clarification. He surged forward, closing the distance to the orc line with the kind of aggressive countercharge that had kept him alive through a dozen hopeless battles. His armor's servos enhanced his strength, letting him move faster than his bulk suggested. He slammed into the nearest orc at full speed, driving his shoulder into the creature's midsection with enough force to crack armor and bone. The impact sent both of them sprawling, mud flying, and Marcus twisted as they fell, bringing the lancer's chainsaw bayonet around in a horizontal arc. The blade bit deep. Teeth screamed through green flesh, spraying blood in a crimson arc that painted Marcus's visor. The orc howled, thrashing, one massive hand closing around Marcus's arm with crushing force. Warnings flashed across his HUD as pressure mounted on the armor plating. Marcus reversed his grip, drove the butt of the lancer into the orc's face, felt bone crunch, then ripped the chainsaw blade sideways through the creature's neck. The orc's roar cut off mid-bellow, dissolving into a wet gurgle, and its grip went slack. Marcus rolled to his feet as 3 more charged him. He fired from the hip, walking backward as the lancer chewed through magazine after magazine. The weapon never jammed, never failed. It was the one constant in a universe that had become utterly wrong. Orcs fell, but more poured forward, and Marcus realized with grim certainty that this was not a battle that could be won, only survived, only delayed. The guardsmen's fire intensified, concentrated volleys cutting down orcs by the dozen, but the green tide kept coming. Bodies piled up, creating makeshift cover that the orcs used to advance, their instinct for war bypassing any need for formal tactics. Marcus saw one orc catch fire from a flamer burst, only to charge forward anyway, spreading flames to its companions before finally collapsing in a smoldering heap. A hand grabbed Marcus's shoulder, spinning him around. The lead guardsman was shouting, his mask inches from Marcus's visor, his voice barely audible over the roar of combat. He pointed back toward the Imperial lines, toward trenches that were rapidly filling with soldiers who fired over sandbag parapets in continuous volleys. The message was clear: fall back or die here. Marcus fired one last burst into the advancing orcs, turned, and ran. The guardsmen retreated with practiced efficiency, leapfrogging back in squads that covered each other's withdrawal. They moved through obstacles that had been placed specifically to slow pursuit, barbed wire and tank traps and ditches filled with stakes. The orcs followed, their charge slowing as the terrain turned against them, but never stopping. They climbed over their own dead, used corpses as shields, and bellowed their war cry loud enough to shake the earth. Marcus vaulted a trench wall and dropped into the Imperial line. The space was narrow, barely wide enough for two men to stand side by side, its walls shored up with corrugated metal and prayers etched into every surface. Guardsmen packed the firing steps, their lasguns resting on sandbag parapets as they poured fire into the oncoming horde. Officers shouted orders, their voices hoarse from hours of continuous combat. Medicae personnel dragged wounded soldiers back from the front line, working with brutal efficiency to stabilize injuries that would have been fatal anywhere else. The air stank of ozone and blood and something else, something that Marcus's filters identified as promethium exhaust. An explosion rocked the trench, dirt raining down as an orc grenade detonated somewhere nearby. Marcus steadied himself against the trench wall, checking his weapon. The magazine indicator showed 60% remaining, enough for another sustained firefight but not an extended engagement. He did not know where he could resupply, did not know if his ammunition was even compatible with whatever these soldiers used. The weight of his situation settled on him like a physical burden. He was alone, stranded on a world he did not recognize, fighting in a war he did not understand, for a cause that was not his own. It was not the first time. The lead guardsman appeared beside him, pulling off his gas mask to reveal a face that was too young and too old at the same time. The man's eyes were sunken, ringed with exhaustion, but sharp with the kind of awareness that only came from prolonged combat. He spoke in clipped Imperial Gothic, his accent thick but understandable now that Marcus's translator suite had more context to work with. "You fight well, stranger, but you fight for the Emperor now, whether you know it or not. Commissar Cult will want to see you. Do not make him wait." Marcus did not know who the Emperor was, or who Commissar Cult was, or what any of this meant, but he knew war when he saw it, and this war had only just begun. The command bunker was dug 15 meters below the surface, its reinforced ceiling designed to withstand orbital bombardment, or at least delay the inevitable. The walls were lined with parchment maps, showing trench networks that stretched across the continent, each position marked with pins that indicated strength, casualties, and estimated time until collapse. The air smelled of recaf, a bitter stimulant that the officers consumed in quantities that suggested addiction or desperation. A single lumen strip cast harsh shadows across faces that had not seen rest in days. Commissar Dreven Kalt stood before the map table, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating the kind of authority that did not need to be announced. He was a tall man, lean and severe, his uniform immaculate despite the conditions. The greatcoat he wore was black as void, its hem brushing the ferrocrete floor. On his chest hung medals and commendations, each one representing a battle where discipline had turned potential rout into victory. At his hip hung a bolt pistol, its grip worn smooth from use, and a power sword whose activation stud showed the telltale scuffing of frequent deployment. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they missed nothing. Marcus stood at attention because the guardsman flanking him had made it clear that anything else would be unwise. His armor was still caked with mud and orc blood, his lancer mag locked to his back. He had refused to surrender his weapon, and the fact that he still carried it suggested that the commissar had allowed the breach of protocol. For now, Kalt studied Marcus with the kind of intensity usually reserved for assessing enemy fortifications. "You are not guard," Kalt said finally, his voice a low baritone that carried absolute certainty. "Your armor is not Astartes pattern. Your weapon is not of Mechanicus origin. Your insignia mean nothing to Imperial records, yet you fight like a soldier who has seen the worst humanity can offer and survived." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I fight because that's what I do. I don't know how I got here. I don't know where here is, but I've been in enough wars to recognize one when I see it." Kalt's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition or perhaps respect. Hell's Reach Minor is a world of trenches and attrition. For 3 months, we have held this line against the orc menace that consumed the eastern continents. 13 regiments have been reduced to 4. Supply lines are stretched to breaking. Reinforcements are not coming. We hold because the Emperor demands it, and because failure means death for every soul on this world. Marcus absorbed the information, slotting it into mental frameworks built from years of strategic briefings. The situation was familiar in its hopelessness: overwhelming enemy, limited resources, no victory condition beyond survival. He had lived this scenario on Syrah during the final years of the Locust War. The details were different, but the fundamentals remained constant. "You need soldiers," Marcus said. It was not a question. "We need men who can kill orcs and not break when they charge," Colt replied. "I have watched you fight. You do not hesitate. You do not panic. You understand violence at a level that most guardsmen take years to learn. If they survive long enough to learn at all, you will be integrated into the 43rd Hellsreach Infantry. You will follow orders. You will fight until I tell you to stop. And in return you will have purpose, supplies, and the Emperor's grace." Marcus considered the offer for exactly 3 seconds. He had no other options. No way home, assuming home still existed. No allies, no resources, no plan beyond immediate survival. The Commissar was offering structure, support, and a clear objective. That was more than Marcus had expected. "What about my equipment?" Marcus asked. "My weapon uses ammunition you don't manufacture. My armor needs maintenance protocols you don't have." Kalt gestured to a figure standing in the shadows near the far wall, a hunched shape wrapped in red robes that rustled like insect wings. The figure shuffled forward into the light, revealing itself as something between human and machine. Its face was hidden behind a brass mask lined with optical sensors that whirred and clicked. Mechadendrites coiled from its back like mechanical serpents, each one tipped with tools whose purpose Marcus could only guess. When it spoke, its voice was a synthesized monotone laced with static. "Enginsir Val 9 will examine your war gear," Kalt said. "The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains all weapons and armor on this world. If your equipment can be sustained, it will be. If not, you will be issued standard guard armaments. Either way, you will be ready for combat within 6 hours." The Enginsir moved closer, its mechadendrites reaching toward Marcus's armor with disturbing eagerness. Marcus fought the instinct to step back, forcing himself to remain still as the machine priest's tools traced the contours of his breastplate, probing seams and analyzing composition with sensors that hummed and clicked. Primitive, but functional. Val 9 droned. Alloy composition suggests pre-imperial metallurgy. Power systems inadequate for sustained operation but sufficient for tactical deployment. Weapon design inefficient but effective. Ammunition synthesis possible with modification to promethium distillation processes. Spirit of the weapon is dormant but not hostile. We may reach accord. Marcus had no idea what that meant, but the engineer seemed satisfied. Kalt nodded once, a gesture that dismissed the tech priest and refocused attention on Marcus. You will report to Sergeant Torven in Trench Sigma 7. He commands a veteran squad that has held its section for 48 days without relief. They have lost 9 men in that time. You will be the 10th replacement. Do not disappoint them. Do not disappoint me. And above all, do not disappoint the Emperor. Marcus wanted to ask who the Emperor was, why that name carried such weight, why every sentence seemed to revolve around devotion to a figure he had never heard of. But the questions felt dangerous, inappropriate, and ultimately irrelevant. He was a soldier. He followed orders. And right now, those orders were clear. Understood, Marcus said. Kalt's expression softened by a fraction, the equivalent of a smile from a man who had forgotten how. You will do well here, Fenix, or you will die here. Either way, the Emperor's will be done. Marcus was dismissed with a gesture, escorted from the bunker by 2 guardsmen who guided him through a maze of tunnels that connected the command post to the forward trenches. The walls were lined with pipes that hissed and leaked, with cables that sparked intermittently, with niches that held shrines to the Emperor, flickering candles illuminating crude artwork of a figure seated on a golden throne. The guardsmen genuflected as they passed each shrine, their lips moving in silent prayer. Marcus said nothing, processing everything he saw, cataloging details that might keep him alive. The tunnels eventually opened into Trench Sigma 7, a fortified position that stretched for 300 meters along the northern defensive line. It was deeper than the previous trench, its walls reinforced with ferrocrete slabs and buttressed with steel beams. Firing steps ran along both sides, sandbags stacked 3 high to provide cover. Heavy weapons emplacements dotted the line at regular intervals, autocannons and heavy bolters manned by crews that never seemed to rest. The air was thick with smoke and the constant background noise of distant artillery, a rhythmic thunder that had become ambient. Sergeant Torven was a blocky man with a face like weathered granite and eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that sleep could not cure. His uniform was patched in a dozen places, his flak armor scored by near misses. When he saw Marcus approaching, he looked him up and down with the critical assessment of a man judging a tool's utility. "So you're the one," Torven said, his voice gravelly. "The stranger who fell from the sky and killed orcs like he'd been doing it all his life. Commissar says you're guard now. I say we'll see how long you last." Marcus unslung his lancer, checking the chamber out of habit. "I've lasted through worse," Torven grunted, the sound carrying grudging approval. "You'll fit in or you'll die. Those are the options. My squad holds this section. We watch the wire. We kill greenskins, and we pray the line doesn't break before reinforcements arrive, which they won't. So mostly we just kill greenskins." He gestured to the men scattered along the trench, exhausted figures in mud-caked uniforms who barely looked up from their posts. "That's Rael on the heavy bolter. Corvus and Masson have the autocannon. Jeth and Prine are riflemen, good shots when they're not shaking. Vask is our Vox operator, and Harren is our Medicae, which means he keeps us alive long enough to die properly." Each name came with a nod or a raised hand, brief acknowledgments from men too tired to care about formalities. Marcus found a spot on the firing step and settled in, his lancer resting across his knees. The view beyond the trench was a wasteland of craters and corpses, barbed wire and burning wreckage. Smoke drifted across the landscape in slow coils, obscuring everything beyond 200 meters. The sky was the color of old bruises, lit from below by fires that never seemed to die. This was hell, not metaphorically, not symbolically. This was a vision of hell made manifest, a place where violence had become geography and death was the only constant. Marcus had been here before, in different forms, on different worlds. He settled in to wait because that was what soldiers did between battles. He did not have to wait long. The assault began at dusk, though on Hellsreach Minor, dusk was merely a deepening of the ambient gloom that passed for daylight. The first warning came from the wire, the sound of metal twisting and snapping as something massive forced its way through the barriers. Vask called it in over the vox, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Torvin bellowed orders, and the squad moved with practiced efficiency, each man taking his position and preparing to kill. Marcus rose to the firing step, bringing his lancer to his shoulder and peering through the scope. The optics struggled with the smoke and darkness, but movement was unmistakable. Shapes emerged from the haze, dozens of them, advancing in a loose mob that suggested coordination without discipline. Orcs. Again. Always orcs. They came in waves that never seemed to diminish, as though the planet itself spawned them from the mud. Range 300 meters and closing, Corvus called from the autocannon emplacement. Permission to engage. Wait for it, Torvin growled. Let them get close. Make every shot count. Marcus watched the horde advance, tracking individual orcs through his scope. He identified leaders, the larger specimens that bellowed orders and waved crude banners. He noted the weapons they carried, massive guns that looked more dangerous to their wielders than their targets, and blades that were simply sheets of sharpened metal bolted to handles. These were not soldiers. They were a force of nature wearing the trappings of warfare, chaos given form and purpose. At 200 meters, Torven gave the order. Open fire. The trench erupted in coordinated violence. Las fire lit up the smoke, hundreds of crimson beams lancing into the advancing orcs. The autocannon thundered, its shells punching through green flesh and detonating inside bodies, turning orcs into explosions of meat and bone. The heavy bolter roared, spitting mass-reactive rounds that tore limbs from torsos and heads from necks. Marcus added his lancer to the chorus, firing in controlled bursts that dropped orcs with mechanical precision. The horde staggered but did not break. Orcs fell by the dozen, their bodies piling up in the killing field. But those behind simply climbed over the corpses and kept coming. Some fired back, their weapons spraying bullets in wild arcs that sparked off ferrocrete and kicked up geysers of mud. A few shots found flesh, and guardsmen screamed as they were hit, falling back from the firing line as Medicae personnel dragged them to safety. Marcus shifted his fire to the larger orcs, the ones wearing more armor and carrying heavier weapons. These were threats that could break the line if left unchecked. He burned through a magazine in seconds, dropped it, and slapped a fresh one home without taking his eyes off the scope. The lancer never overheated, never jammed, and Marcus thanked every engineer who had designed it to function in the worst possible conditions. An explosion rocked the trench as an orc grenade detonated against the parapet, spraying shrapnel that pinged off Marcus's armor. He felt the impacts like distant hammers, warnings from his HUD about superficial damage that could be ignored. He kept firing, adjusting his aim as the orcs closed to 100 meters, then 75, then 50. They were inside minimum effective range for most weapons, and panic began to ripple through the guardsmen. Torven saw it and responded with the only tool that mattered: fix bayonets. The order was archaic, suicidal, exactly what was needed. Guardsmen drew combat knives and affixed them to their lasguns, transforming ranged weapons into makeshift spears. Torven drew his chainsword, its blade roaring to life with a sound that cut through the chaos. He stood at the center of the line, visible to every man in the trench, and raised the weapon high. "For the Emperor!" he roared. "Hold the line!" The orcs crashed into the trench. What followed was not combat but butchery, a desperate melee where every second was measured in blood and screaming. Orcs vaulted the parapet, their massive forms crashing down among the guardsmen like living avalanches. They swung crude weapons with bone-crushing force, each blow capable of caving in skulls or shattering ribs. The guardsmen fought back with bayonets and knives, stabbing at green flesh that seemed to shrug off wounds that would have killed humans instantly. Marcus dropped his lancer and drew his combat knife, a blade designed for close-quarters work against enemies that wore chitin armor and stood 7 feet tall. He drove it into the throat of an orc that loomed over him, twisted and ripped sideways. Hot blood sprayed across his visor, and he shoved the dying creature backward into its companions. He retrieved his lancer, activated the chainsaw bayonet, and waded into the press. The blade screamed through flesh and bone, its teeth chewing through orc anatomy with relentless efficiency. Marcus moved with brutal economy, each motion designed to kill or maim, each step calculated to keep him from being surrounded. He had fought in close quarters before, in the warrens beneath Sera's cities, where the Locust had turned every corridor into a kill zone. This was no different. Smaller spaces, higher stakes, same fundamental rules. Kill them before they kill you. An orc swung a massive cleaver at Marcus's head, the blade whistling through the air with enough force to decapitate. Marcus ducked under the swing, drove his shoulder into the orc's midsection, and brought the chainsaw blade up through its jaw. The orc's roar turned into a wet gurgle, and it collapsed, thrashing. Marcus kicked it aside and kept moving, his armor's servos straining as he grappled with enemies that outweighed him by hundreds of pounds. To his left, Torven fought like a man possessed, his chainsword cutting through orcs with practiced brutality. To his right, Jeth and Prine worked in tandem, one stabbing while the other provided cover fire at point-blank range. The trench was chaos incarnate, a swirling melee where friend and foe were distinguished only by the color of their blood. And then, as suddenly as it began, the assault broke. The surviving orcs fell back, not in rout but in recognition that this position was too costly to take. They retreated into the smoke, dragging their wounded and bellowing challengers that promised future violence. The guardsmen let them go, too exhausted to pursue, too focused on survival to care about anything beyond the immediate. Marcus leaned against the trench wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps that his armor's rebreather struggled to regulate. His lancer dripped with orc blood, the chainsaw blade still spinning down from maximum revolutions. Around him, the trench was a scene of devastation. Bodies littered the ground, human and orc alike, their blood mixing into the mud until it became a crimson slurry. The wounded screamed for Medicae. The dying whispered prayers. The survivors simply stared at nothing, their minds processing horrors that would haunt them forever. Torven moved through the carnage, checking on his men, offering words of encouragement or comfort depending on what was needed. When he reached Marcus, he stopped and studied the man for a long moment. "You saved lives today," Torven said quietly. "Kept the line from breaking when it should have. I don't know what war you fought before this one, but you've earned your place here." Marcus said nothing, too tired to form words that mattered. Torven clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that transcended language or culture. "Get some rest. We'll be at it again in a few hours. They always come back. The orcs always come back." Marcus found a relatively clean section of trench wall and settled against it, his lancer across his knees, his eyes half closed but never truly shutting. Around him, the guardsmen did the same, each man stealing what sleep he could before the next assault. The artillery continued its distant thunder, the smoke never cleared, the fires never died. This was Hellsreach Minor. This was the Imperium of Man, and Marcus Fenix, soldier of a dead civilization, had become one more body standing between humanity and extinction. 3 days passed in a blur of combat and exhaustion. Marcus learned the rhythms of trench warfare on Hell's Reach Minor, the patterns that governed when orcs attacked and when they regrouped, the shifts in artillery fire that signaled incoming barrages or enemy advances. He learned the names of the guardsmen in Torven's squad, memorizing faces and voices and the small details that made them human rather than just statistics waiting to happen. He learned to eat the rations that tasted like compressed cardboard and chemicals, to drink the recaf that kept sleep at bay, to sleep in 5-minute increments when the opportunity presented itself. He learned that the Imperium of Man was an empire so vast that individual planets were mere footnotes in histories that spanned millennia, that the emperor they worshipped was a corpse seated on a throne of gold, sustained by psychic sacrifice and bureaucratic inertia, a god figure whose will was interpreted by priests and enforced by commissars. That humanity in this age had regressed to a state of technological stagnation and religious fervor, where innovation was heresy and faith was the only currency that mattered. He learned that Hell's Reach Minor was dying, and everyone knew it. The orc invasion had gained momentum despite every defensive success. For every trench held, 2 more were overrun. For every greenskin killed, 3 more emerged from the fungal spores that permeated the planet's soil. The Guard was fighting a war of attrition it could not win, bleeding slowly while the enemy grew stronger. Reinforcements were not coming. Evacuation was not an option. The only choice was to fight until the end, and then fight some more because dying well mattered more than dying at all. It was madness. It was Sarah all over again, the final days of the Locust War writ large across an entire planet. Marcus found a grim comfort in the familiarity. On the 4th day, the orders changed. Torven gathered the squad in a section of trench that offered relative privacy, away from the heavy weapons, emplacements, and the Vox stations. His expression was grave, his posture tense in a way that suggested the news was worse than usual. The men sensed it immediately, their exhaustion giving way to wary attention. "Command wants us to conduct a reconnaissance in force," Torven said without preamble. "Intelligence reports suggest the orcs are building something in Sector Gamma 9, something big. We're going out there to see what it is and report back. If possible, we sabotage it. If not, we gather data and get out." Masson cursed under his breath. "That's a death sentence, Sarge. Gamma 9 is 5 kilometers into enemy territory. We'll be surrounded before we make it halfway." Torven did not argue the point because it was objectively true. Commissar Kalt chose us because we're expendable and experienced. We go in at dusk, use the smoke for cover, and move fast. Fenix, you're on point. Your armor gives you the best chance of surviving first contact. Rael and Corvus, your fire support. Jeth, Prine, Vask, you're with me. Harren stays here. We can't risk losing our Medicae on a suicide run. Marcus met Torven's eyes and saw the apology there, unspoken but genuine. The sergeant had not asked for this mission any more than the rest of them, but orders were orders, and in the Imperial Guard, refusing orders meant execution by bolt pistol. Kalt had made that abundantly clear. "When do we move?" Marcus asked. 2 hours. Get your gear ready. Say your prayers if you have any, and try not to think about the odds because they're shit. The squad dispersed, each man preparing in his own way. Marcus checked his lancer, confirmed his ammunition count, inspected his armor for damage that might compromise its integrity. Engin Seer Val 9 had done impressive work over the past days, synthesizing rounds that fit Marcus's weapon and patching breaches in his armor with materials that the tech priest claimed were blessed by the Omnissiah. Marcus did not understand the theology, but the repairs held, and that was all that mattered. Vask approached as Marcus finished his checks, the Vox operator's youthful face lined with worry that he tried to hide behind bravado. "Is it true you come from another world?" "Not another planet in the Imperium, but something else entirely?" Marcus considered the question, weighing the value of honesty against the danger of revealing too much. Something like that. What was it like? Your world? Dying, Marcus said. Just like this one. Vask absorbed that, nodded slowly, and walked away without another word. 2 hours later, the squad assembled at a sally port, a reinforced gate set into the trench wall that opened onto no man's land. Torven conducted a final equipment check, ensuring every man carried extra ammunition, demo charges, and signal flares. Marcus noticed that each guardsman also carried a small prayer scroll tucked into their helmet liner, a final benediction in case they did not return. Torven keyed the vox, speaking quietly to whoever was monitoring their frequency. Sigma 7 patrol ready to deploy. Emperor watch over us. The response was crackling static that might have been acknowledgement or simply atmospheric interference. The sally port opened with a grinding of gears, revealing the wasteland beyond. Smoke drifted across the landscape in lazy coils, thick enough to obscure vision beyond 30 meters. The ground was a nightmare of craters and corpses, twisted metal and unexploded ordnance. In the distance, something roared, a sound that vibrated through the earth like the heartbeat of a dying god. Marcus took point, his lancer raised and ready, his armor's sensors painting ghostly shapes through the smoke. The squad followed in single file, maintaining 5-meter intervals to minimize casualties from explosions or ambush. They moved with the practiced stealth of men who had survived by not being seen, their boots finding solid ground through instinct and experience. The landscape transformed as they advanced, trenches giving way to craters, giving way to ruins of structures that had once been hab blocks or manufactorums. The orcs had been here, their presence marked by crude fortifications and the remains of campfires built from furniture and corpses. Marcus saw evidence of infighting, orc bodies torn apart by weapons that could only have been wielded by other orcs, violence for its own sake. They covered 2 kilometers in 40 minutes, a glacial pace that reflected the need for caution over speed. The smoke thickened as they moved deeper into enemy territory, and Marcus's sensors began picking up thermal signatures that suggested large concentrations of bodies ahead. He raised a fist, signaling the squad to halt, and Torven moved up to join him at the front. "What do you see?" Torven whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of distant combat. Marcus gestured toward the smoke, where shapes moved in organized patterns that suggested construction or fortification. Something big, multiple heat signatures, too organized for random orc movement. Torven pulled out magnoculars, adjusting the focus as he peered through the haze. When he finally lowered the device, his expression was bleak. "Emperor preserve us," he muttered. "They're building a gargant." Marcus did not know what a gargant was, but the fear in Torven's voice told him everything he needed to know. How bad? "A gargant is a walking fortress," Torven explained, his voice tight. 50 meters tall, armored like a battleship, armed with enough firepower to level cities. If they finish that thing and march it on our lines, we're done. Every trench between here and the command bunker will be crushed in hours. Marcus processed the information, slotting it into tactical frameworks that suggested exactly one course of action. Then we sabotage it. Now, before it's operational. Torven stared at him as though he had suggested they charge the Eye of Terror. "You're insane. There are hundreds of orcs around that construction site. We're 7 men with small arms and a handful of demo charges. We'd be torn apart before we got within 50 meters of the target." "Then we need a distraction," Marcus said. "Something that pulls them away long enough for us to plant charges and get clear." "Like what?" Marcus considered the options, weighing variables that included terrain, enemy disposition, available resources, and acceptable losses. The calculation was simple but brutal. They were expendable. The mission was not. Success required sacrifice, and the only question was how to maximize the damage before they were all killed. We split up, Marcus said. "Half the squad creates a diversion on the western approach. Draw as many orcs as possible away from the Gargant. The rest of us use the confusion to infiltrate the construction site, plant charges on load-bearing supports, and blow it to hell." Torvin was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he wrestled with the decision. Finally, he nodded. "Corvus, Rael, Vask, you're with me. We'll create the diversion. Fenix, Jeth, Prine, you take the demo charges and hit the Gargant. Vask, give Fenix your Vox. He'll signal when the charges are set, and we all run like hell." The squad acknowledged the orders with grim determination, each man understanding that this was likely a one-way trip. They moved closer to the construction site, using rubble and smoke for concealment, until they could see the Gargant in all its horrifying glory. It was a titan born from scrap and madness, a towering effigy of violence that defied logic and physics. Its frame was constructed from girders and armor plates welded together with zero regard for aesthetics or efficiency. Massive limbs terminated in weapons that looked like naval cannons mounted on rotary joints. The head was a slab of metal bristling with tusks and gun barrels, its eyes glowing with crude optical sensors. Hundreds of orcs swarmed over it like insects, welding and hammering and shouting in their guttural tongue. It was almost complete. Marcus counted the seconds until they ran out, then keyed the Vox. Execute. Torven's half of the squad opened fire from the west, las rifles and grenades creating a cacophony that drew immediate attention. Orcs roared and charged toward the noise, abandoning their posts in the kind of aggressive response that Marcus had learned to predict. Dozens rushed toward the distraction, eager to kill, and the construction site's defenses thinned by half. Marcus signaled Jeth and Prine, and the three of them moved. They sprinted through smoke and shadows, using the chaos as cover, their movements synchronized through training and desperation. Marcus led, his lancer sweeping for threats, and twice he dropped orcs that wandered too close. The bodies fell silently, their deaths unnoticed in the confusion. They reached the Gargant's legs, massive columns of metal that rose into the smoke like the pillars of a dark cathedral. "Plant the charges," Marcus ordered, passing demo packs to Jeth and Prine. "Target the joints. We blow the legs and the whole thing collapses." They worked with frantic efficiency, attaching charges to structural points that looked critical, setting timers that would give them 5 minutes to clear the blast radius. Marcus covered them, his weapon tracking movement through the smoke, his finger hovering over the trigger. Sweat ran down his face inside the helmet, mixing with blood from a cut he had not noticed. A roar split the air, close and furious. Marcus spun to find an orc nobe bearing down on them, a creature easily 4 meters tall and twice as wide as any human. It wore armor plates bolted directly into its flesh and carried a weapon that looked like a cross between a chainsaw and a rocket launcher. Its eyes burned with manic fury, and when it saw the humans planting explosives on its prize, it opened its mouth and bellowed. "Wah!" Marcus fired, burning through half a magazine in seconds. The rounds punched smoking holes through the knob's armor, but failed to stop its charge. It closed the distance in 3 ground-shaking strides, swinging its weapon in a horizontal arc that would have bisected Marcus if he had not thrown himself flat. The blade passed centimeters over his head, sparks flying as it struck the Gargant's leg. Jeth and Prine opened fire, their lasguns adding to the barrage, but the knob ignored them. It focused on Marcus with single-minded intensity, recognizing him as the primary threat. It raised its weapon for another swing, and Marcus rolled, coming up into a crouch and triggering his chainsaw bayonet. The lancer's blade roared to life, and Marcus lunged forward, driving the spinning teeth into the knob's knee joint. Sparks flew as metal met metal, and the blade bit deep, cutting through crude welding and into green flesh beneath. The knob howled and staggered, its leg buckling, and Marcus ripped the blade free and reversed the cut, soaring through the other knee. The knob collapsed, its legs unable to support its bulk, and Marcus pressed the lancer's muzzle against its skull and emptied the magazine. The creature's roar cut off mid-bellow, and silence descended. Charges set. Prine gasped, his voice shaking. "We need to move now." Marcus keyed the vox. Charges planted. Falling back. 60 seconds to detonation. Torven's response was drowned out by gunfire and orc roars, but Marcus caught the acknowledgement. They ran, sprinting away from the gargant as fast as exhaustion and terrain allowed. Behind them, orcs began to notice the demo charges, their crude intellect recognizing the threat, but too late to matter. The timer hit 0. The world exploded. The gargant's legs detonated in sequence, each charge a concentrated burst of military-grade explosives that shattered metal and sent shockwaves rippling through the structure. The joints gave way, the massive frame tilted, and physics asserted itself with inexorable finality. The gargant toppled sideways, its fall accelerating as gravity took hold, and when it struck the ground, the impact was seismic. The shockwave knocked Marcus off his feet, sent him tumbling through the mud, and filled the air with debris and fire. Secondary explosions rippled through the wreckage as ammunition cooked off, turning the construction site into a raging inferno. Orcs screamed, caught in the blast or crushed beneath tons of falling metal, their bodies consumed by flames that reached toward the sky. Marcus dragged himself to his feet, ears ringing, vision blurred, and saw Jeth and Prine doing the same. They staggered toward the rendezvous point, where Torven's squad was already falling back under heavy fire. The distraction had worked, but the orcs were regrouping, and pursuit was inevitable. "Run!" Torven bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Back to the lines. Move!" They ran. The journey back was a nightmare of close calls and desperate firefights. Orcs pursuing them through the smoke like hounds on the scent. Marcus's lancer clicked empty, and he transitioned to his sidearm, a crude auto-pistol he had scavenged from a dead guardsman days earlier. The weapon was temperamental and inaccurate, but it fired, and that was enough. They fought their way through ambush after ambush, losing ground slowly, buying time with blood. Vask took a round through the shoulder and kept moving, his face pale but determined. Rail's heavy bolter jammed, and he discarded it, drawing a combat knife to fight hand-to-hand when orcs got too close. Corvus twisted his ankle in a crater and limped the rest of the way, supported by Prine. They reached the Imperial lines just as dawn broke, or what passed for dawn on Hell's Reach Minor. The sally port opened, and guardsmen pulled them through, slamming the gate shut behind them as orc bullets pinged off the metal. The trench exploded in activity, soldiers rushing to defensive positions as the pursuing horde crashed against the wire. Marcus collapsed against the trench wall, his armor's power reserves flashing critical warnings, his body screaming protests that he ignored. Around him, the squad did the same, each man too exhausted to speak, too numb to process what they had accomplished. Commissar Colt appeared, his greatcoat pristine despite the conditions, his expression unreadable. He surveyed the returning squad, counted faces, noted injuries. When he spoke, his voice carried across the trench, audible to every guardsman within earshot. "You have struck a blow against the Emperor's enemies. The Gargant is destroyed. The Orc advance has been delayed. You have done your duty, and the Imperium acknowledges your sacrifice." He paused, his gaze settling on Marcus with an intensity that suggested recognition or perhaps curiosity. "Sergeant Fenix, report to the command bunker once you have been cleared by the Medicae. Your actions today have earned the Emperor's favor. Do not waste it." Marcus nodded, too tired to do anything else. The assault began 20 minutes later, as though the orcs had been waiting for the perfect moment to punish the Imperium for its audacity. They came in a tide that dwarfed previous attacks, thousands of greenskins screaming their war cry as they charged across no man's land. The trenches erupted in coordinated fire, every weapon on the line unleashing hell, and Marcus pulled himself to the firing step to add his lancer to the defense. The battle raged for 6 hours without pause, and when it finally ended, Marcus understood with grim certainty that this was not a war that could be won, only endured. The command bunker felt smaller than before, the walls pressing in with the weight of accumulated failures and desperate strategies. The map table showed red pins spreading across the continent like an infection, each one representing a lost position or an overrun trench. The officers gathered around it spoke in low tones, their voices carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from making impossible decisions with inadequate resources. Commissar Colt stood apart from the group, his posture radiating controlled fury, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that suggested calculation rather than anger. When he spoke, his voice cut through the murmured conversations, commanding absolute attention. "The destruction of the Gargant has bought us time," Colt said. "Perhaps a week, perhaps less. The Orcs will regroup, rebuild, and resume their advance. We cannot stop them indefinitely, but we can delay them long enough for evacuation protocols to be initiated." One of the officers, a haggard colonel with a cybernetic eye that whirred and clicked, looked up sharply. "The Munitorum has authorized evacuation." "When?" "They have not," Colt replied, his tone flat. "And they will not. Hellsreach Minor is expendable. We are expendable. But I did not swear my oaths to abandon the Emperor's subjects to die without purpose." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that Marcus did not fully understand but could sense nonetheless. The Commissar was suggesting something that bordered on heresy, a deviation from orders that could result in his execution if reported, yet no one in the bunker spoke against him, and that silence was its own form of consent. Colt turned his attention fully to Marcus. "You fought on a world that fell to Xenos invasion. You survived because you adapted, because you understood that survival required sacrifice and compromise. I need that experience. I need someone who can think beyond doctrine and faith, who can make decisions based on pragmatism rather than ideology." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to lead a strike force into the heart of the Orc horde. Not to destroy it, that is impossible, but to decapitate it. Kill the war boss. Scatter the Orcs into infighting and chaos. Buy us the time we need to evacuate as many civilians as possible before this world burns." The proposal was insane, a suicide mission dressed up as strategy, but Marcus had led insane missions before, had walked into death traps because someone needed to and he was expendable. He understood the calculus that turned soldiers into statistics, lives into acceptable losses. He had been making that calculation since his father died in the tunnels beneath Serra. "How many men?" Marcus asked. 50. Volunteers only, the best fighters from regiments across the line. You will have Sergeant Torvan and his squad as your core unit. The rest will be assembled within the hour. Equipment? Whatever you need. The Mechanicus will provide support. Enginsir Val 9 has taken a particular interest in your war gear and has requested permission to accompany the strike force. I have granted it. Marcus absorbed the information, already running calculations about approach vectors, enemy disposition, and exit strategies. The mission was a long shot, borderline impossible, but that described most of the operations he had survived. The key was to break it into manageable objectives, to focus on the next step rather than the overall goal. "I'll need intelligence on the war boss," Marcus said. "Location, defenses, command structure. Anything that tells me how to kill it." Colt gestured to a junior officer who hurried forward with a data slate covered in crude pictographs and captured Orc communications. "The war boss calls itself Grimscar the Unbreakable. It commands from a fortified position 15 kilometers northeast of here, a stronghold built into the ruins of a hive city. Intelligence suggests it has at least 1,000 Orcs under direct command, with thousands more in the surrounding territory. It is cunning for an orc, which means it will anticipate attacks and prepare accordingly. Marcus studied the data slate, committing details to memory. The stronghold was a natural fortress, elevated terrain with clear sightlines and multiple defensive layers. A frontal assault would be suicide. Infiltration offered better odds but required bypassing or eliminating sentries without raising alarms. The operation would need to be surgical, fast, and brutal. "I'll need heavy weapons," Marcus said. "Anti-armor ordnance, explosives, anything that can punch through orc fortifications. It will be provided. You leave at dusk. The Emperor protects, Sergeant Fenix. See that you do the same for his subjects." Marcus was dismissed, escorted back to the trenches by a pair of guardsmen who maintained respectful silence. The news of the impending strike force had already spread, carried by the Vox network, and whispered conversations that traveled faster than official orders. Soldiers watched Marcus pass with expressions that ranged from respect to pity, understanding that he had volunteered for an operation that was one step removed from execution. Torven was waiting at Trench Sigma 7, his squad gathered around him in a loose circle. When he saw Marcus approaching, he straightened, and the men followed suit. "Heard you're leading the charge into the Greenskins' den," Torven said, his voice carefully neutral. "Also heard you're taking volunteers. We're in." Marcus looked at each man in turn, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes, the injuries they carried, the scars that would never fully heal. These were broken men held together by duty and desperation, soldiers who had lost everything except the will to keep fighting. They should have been rotated off the line months ago, given rest and medical treatment and time to remember what it meant to be human rather than just weapons. Instead, they were volunteering to march into hell one more time. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't your fight." "It's the only fight we have," Torven replied. "We die here or we die there. At least there, we take the bastard with us." The logic was irrefutable, and Marcus found himself nodding. "Get your gear. We move in 2 hours." The strike force assembled in a staging area behind the main line, 50 men drawn from a dozen different regiments. They were a motley collection of veterans and survivors, each one bearing the marks of prolonged combat. Some wore the uniform of Cadian shock troops, their discipline evident in their posture and equipment maintenance. Others were Catachan jungle fighters, scarred and muscled, carrying knives that looked more like short swords. A few were deathcore of Krieg, silent and unsettling behind their gas masks, their reputation for suicidal bravery preceding them. Enginseer Val 9 moved among them, blessing weapons with oils and incense, chanting prayers in binary that seemed to calm the machine spirits inhabiting the guard's wargear. When the tech priest reached Marcus, the mechadendrites extended tools that performed diagnostics on his armor, checking power levels and structural integrity. "Your spirit is strong," Val 9 droned, "but it hungers. I have prepared offerings." The Enginseer produced ammunition magazines that gleamed with fresh manufacture, rounds that had been consecrated with rituals Marcus did not understand but appreciated nonetheless. Each magazine was marked with high Gothic script, prayers to the Omnissiah and the Emperor, blessings that might or might not make a difference but cost nothing to accept. "Thank you," Marcus said, mag-locking the ammunition to his armor. Val 9's optical sensors focused on him with disconcerting intensity. "You do not believe in the Omnissiah. You do not kneel before the Emperor, yet you fight for them nonetheless. Why?" Marcus considered the question, weighing honesty against expedience. "Because it's what I do. Because someone has to. Because the alternative is worse." The tech priest processed this, mechanical systems whirring as data was analyzed and filed. "You are a weapon without faith. Dangerous. Useful. The Omnissiah values function over devotion. You will serve adequately." It was the closest thing to a blessing Marcus had received in this universe, and he accepted it without comment. The strike force departed at dusk, moving in dispersed formation through terrain that had been contested for so long that the earth itself seemed to have died. They advanced without vehicle support, relying on speed and stealth to avoid detection. Marcus led from the front, his armor's sensors sweeping for threats, his lancer ready. Behind him, the 50 men moved with the practiced silence of killers who knew their trade. They covered 5 kilometers in 3 hours, encountering minimal resistance. Scattered orc sentries were eliminated with knives and suppressed las fire, their bodies hidden in craters to delay discovery. The landscape grew more industrial as they advanced, ruins of manufactorums and refineries rising from the ash like the bones of dead giants. Orc graffiti covered every surface, crude symbols that Marcus's translator suite identified as territorial markers and declarations of dominance. At the 10-kilometer mark, they encountered their first significant obstacle. A checkpoint manned by 24 orcs blocked the main approach to the stronghold, crude fortifications and heavy weapons, creating a kill zone that would shred any force attempting to pass. Marcus called a halt, gathering the squad leaders to assess options. "We can go around," suggested a Catachan sergeant named Harke, his voice a low growl. "Add 2 hours to the approach, but avoid the fight." "Or we go through," countered Acadian lieutenant named Saren. "Fast and brutal. Kill them before they can raise the alarm." Marcus studied the checkpoint through magnoculars, noting the positions of heavy weapons, the patrol patterns, the crude Vox equipment that would allow the orcs to call for reinforcements. A firefight was inevitable if they took the direct route, and noise would compromise the entire operation. But the detour would consume time they did not have, and delays increased the risk of discovery. "We split the difference," Marcus decided. "Hark, take 10 men and circle to the north. Hit them from the flank when I give the signal. Saren, you're with me." We advance to optimal firing range and open up on my mark. Fast, coordinated, and we move before reinforcements arrive. The plan was simple, brutal, and predicated on speed over subtlety. It was the kind of plan Marcus had executed dozens of times, on battlefields that ranged from city ruins to underground caverns. The fundamentals remained constant: identify the target, concentrate force, execute before the enemy could respond. They moved into position, Hark's squad disappearing into the smoke while Marcus's group advanced to within 200 meters of the checkpoint. Marcus counted down on his internal chrono, synchronized with Hark's Vox signal, and when the timer hit 0, he opened fire. The Lancer roared, its muzzle flash lighting up the smoke, and orcs fell before they understood they were under attack. Saren's Cadians added disciplined volleys, las fire cutting through green flesh with surgical precision. From the north, Harker's Catachans emerged, screaming, their assault brutal and personal, knives and flamers turning the checkpoint into an abattoir. The fight lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, 24 orcs lay dead or dying, and the strike force suffered 3 wounded, none critically. They moved through the checkpoint without pausing, knowing that the noise would draw attention and that speed was their only defense. Marcus pushed the pace, driving the men forward through exhaustion and pain, because stopping meant death, and death meant failure. They reached the outskirts of the stronghold just before midnight. The ruins of the Hive City rose before them, a mountain of ferrocrete and steel twisted by war into something almost organic. Orc fortifications covered every approach, crude but effective, heavy weapons positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Searchlights swept the ground, illuminating patches of territory in stark white before plunging them back into darkness. The air stank of promethium and rot, and from somewhere deep within the stronghold, drums beat a rhythm that seemed to sync with the planet's dying heartbeat. Marcus crouched behind a collapsed wall, studying the defenses with the cold assessment of a man who had infiltrated enemy positions too many times to count. The stronghold was a nightmare of overlapping kill zones and death traps, designed more by instinct than planning but no less effective for it. A conventional assault would be slaughtered before reaching the walls, but conventional assault was not the plan. "Val 9, Marcus called, and the engine seer scuttled forward, mechadendrites clicking against rubble. "Can you disable those searchlights? Give us a window to infiltrate?" The tech priest studied the defenses, optical sensors zooming and analyzing. "Possible. The Orc technology is crude, reliant on brute force rather than elegance. I can introduce failures in the power distribution, cascading malfunctions that will appear as system degradation rather than sabotage. Duration of blackout: 4 minutes. That's enough. Do it." Val 9's mechadendrites extended, producing tools that looked like crosses between screwdrivers and arcane instruments. The tech priest moved to a junction box half buried in rubble, its wiring exposed and sparking, and began manipulating connections with disturbing speed. Binary chants emerged from hidden speakers, prayers to the machine spirit or perhaps instructions. Marcus could not tell. The work took 90 seconds, and when Val 9 withdrew, the searchlights flickered once, twice, then died. The stronghold plunged into darkness. "Move!" Marcus hissed, and the strike force surged forward. They crossed the killing ground in a sprint, boots pounding mud, breath rasping, every man expecting bullets to tear into them at any moment. But the darkness held, and they reached the outer wall without raising alarms. Marcus pressed himself against the ferrocrete, feeling its rough surface, and looked up at the fortification that loomed above. 30 meters of sheer wall, topped with razor wire and gun emplacements. Hark appeared beside him, pulling climbing gear from his pack. "Catachans are used to vertical assault. We'll lead. Give us 2 minutes to reach the top and secure a position. Then follow." Marcus nodded, and Hark's men began their ascent, moving with the kind of speed and confidence that came from years of jungle warfare where vertical was just another direction. They climbed in silence, their movements barely audible over the ambient noise of the stronghold. Marcus watched them through his visor's enhanced vision, tracking their progress, his finger hovering over the lancer's trigger. The searchlights flickered back to life, with 15 seconds remaining. The beams swept across the wall, illuminating the climbing Catachans in harsh white light. An orc sentry saw them, opened its mouth to bellow, and Hark threw a knife that took it through the throat. The orc collapsed without a sound, but others were turning, noticing the breach, raising weapons. "Go!" Marcus roared, abandoning stealth for speed. The strike force charged up the wall, using climbing gear and brute strength, racing the orcs who scrambled to respond. Las fire lit up the darkness as the first defenders opened fire, beams punching through flesh and forcing men to fall. Marcus climbed with his lancer slung, his armor's servo straining as he hauled himself upward. Bullets spanged off his pauldrons, warnings flashing across his HUD, but he did not slow. He reached the top as Hark's Catachans engaged the orcs in brutal melee, knives and fists and sheer aggression overwhelming the defenders. Marcus added his weight to the fight, his lancer's chainsaw blade screaming through green flesh, and the wall was secured in 30 seconds of frantic violence. "Regroup," Marcus shouted, and the strike force assembled on the stronghold's upper level, 50 men reduced to 47 by the climb and the fighting. They were inside the enemy's defenses now, surrounded by thousands of orcs, with no clear exit and a target somewhere in the labyrinth below. Marcus keyed the Vox to command frequency, reporting their position and status. Commissar Colt's response was brief and devoid of comfort. "The Emperor protects. Complete your mission. Die well." The Vox clicked off, and Marcus was left with 46 men, inadequate weapons, and a ticking clock that counted down to their deaths. "Find the war boss," he said to Torvin. "Kill it. Get out. That's the mission. Everything else is optional." Torvin grinned, the expression savage and humorless. "Sounds like every mission we've ever run. Let's get it done." They descended into the stronghold, into the heart of the orc horde, and Marcus felt a grim satisfaction settle over him like a familiar coat. This was what he did. This was what he had always done. And if this was where it ended, at least it would end on his terms. The stronghold's interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one more chaotic than the last. Orc architecture followed no discernible logic. Spaces connected by necessity rather than design, floors and ceilings at odd angles, walls covered in crude murals depicting violence and conquest. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies, and from every direction came the sound of drums and roaring voices, a constant background noise that set teeth on edge. The strike force moved through the labyrinth like ghosts, killing sentries with knives and suppressed weapons, dragging bodies into shadows to delay discovery. Marcus led with his visor's sensors, painting thermal signatures through walls, identifying orc positions and plotting routes that minimized contact. Behind him, the soldiers moved with the discipline of veterans who understood that noise meant death. They descended 3 levels, the passages growing wider and more ornate, crude banners hanging from the ceiling, and trophy racks displaying skulls that Marcus hoped were Xenos rather than human. The drums grew louder, their rhythm accelerating, and Marcus realized they were approaching something significant. A challenge roar echoed through the corridors, so loud it seemed to shake the walls. The strike force froze, weapons raised, waiting for the inevitable response. But no alarm sounded. No orcs came charging. The roar faded into silence, and after a tense moment, Marcus signaled them to continue. They reached a set of massive doors, crude metal slabs reinforced with what looked like tank armor and decorated with impact craters that suggested they had been tested by actual gunfire. Beyond the doors, the drums reached a crescendo, and voices chanted in guttural synchronization, a war cry that vibrated through the ferrocrete. "The war boss is through there," Val 9 stated, the tech priest's sensors analyzing acoustic signatures. Mass readings suggest between 200 and 300 orcs in the chamber beyond. Probability of survival, if we engage directly, 0.03%. "So we don't engage directly," Marcus said. He turned to Saren, the Cadian lieutenant who had proven himself competent in every engagement so far. "How much demo do we have left?" Saren checked with his men, then reported, 30 kilograms of standard-grade explosives, enough to bring down a building if placed correctly. Marcus studied the doors, calculating blast radius and structural weaknesses. "We plant charges on the doors and the support pillars, blow them simultaneously, collapse the chamber on top of the war boss, and bury it under 1,000 tons of rubble." Torven looked skeptical. "You want to drop a building on an orc war boss? That'll work?" It worked on the Gargant. "And if it doesn't kill the war boss outright, it'll scatter the horde into infighting over who takes command. Either way, we accomplish the mission." The logic was sound, and no one offered alternatives. The strike force spread out, planting charges on load-bearing supports with the kind of speed that came from practice and desperation. Val 9 moved among them, blessing each explosive with oils and prayers, ensuring that the machine spirits understood their purpose. Marcus placed the final charge on the doors themselves, a shaped charge designed to blow inward and ensure maximum structural damage. He set the timer for 2 minutes, synchronized across all explosives, and keyed the Vox. Charges set. Falling back to minimum safe distance. "On my mark, we run, and don't stop until we're clear of the blast radius." The strike force withdrew, moving back through the corridors they had infiltrated, retracing their path with practiced efficiency. Marcus counted down the seconds in his head, visualizing the timer ticking toward 0, the charges detonating in sequence, the stronghold collapsing under its own weight. The timer hit 0. The world shook. The explosion was less sound and more force, a shockwave that slammed through the stronghold like the fist of an angry god. The floor buckled, the ceiling cracked, and chunks of ferrocrete rained down as structural supports gave way. Marcus felt himself lifted and thrown, his armor absorbing impacts that would have pulverized an unarmored human. He crashed into a wall, rebounded, and hit the floor hard enough to crack his visor. Warnings screamed across his HUD, red alerts indicating catastrophic damage to multiple systems. He forced himself upright, checking for injuries, and found blood running down his face from a cut across his forehead. His left arm hung at an odd angle, pain lancing through his shoulder where something had torn. But he was alive, and his lancer was still functional, and that was all that mattered. Around him, the strike force struggled to their feet, battered and bleeding but alive. The corridor they occupied had partially collapsed, blocking the path they had taken, forcing them to find alternate routes. Behind them, where the war boss's chamber had been, there was only rubble and smoke and the sound of grinding metal. "Status," Marcus called, his voice hoarse. Torven appeared through the smoke, supporting Vask, whose leg was bent at a wrong angle. 12 casualties, 4 critical, the rest are mobile. We need to move before the greenskins figure out what happened. As if in response, a roar rose from deeper in the stronghold, a sound of pure fury that promised violence beyond reason. The orcs had realized they were under attack, and now they were coming. "Exfil route compromised," Saren reported, his voice clipped. "Suggest we punch through to the western wall and blow our way out." "Do it," Marcus ordered. "Double time. Leave no one behind." They ran. The stronghold had transformed into a death trap, corridors collapsing, smoke choking visibility, orcs emerging from side passages to attack in frenzied mobs. The strike force fought running battles through the chaos, last fire and explosions lighting up the darkness, men falling and being dragged forward by their comrades. Marcus burned through magazines, his lancer overheating from sustained fire, the barrel glowing cherry red. They reached the western wall to find it intact, but defended by 30 orcs who had been alerted to the breach. The greenskins charged without hesitation, eager to kill, and the strike force met them head-on because there was no other choice. The fight was brutal and personal, soldiers grappling with enemies twice their size, bayonets and knives and fists deciding outcomes. Marcus waded into the melee, his chainsaw blade carving through orcs with mechanical efficiency. His injured arm hung useless, but he fought one-handed, using his armor's mass as a weapon, shoulder-checking orcs off their feet and executing them with point-blank bursts. Pain was distant, relegated to background noise by adrenaline and combat drugs his armor had automatically injected. The orcs broke, not from fear but from simple mathematics. They were outnumbered, outfought, and their instinct for self-preservation finally overrode their lust for violence. The survivors fled deeper into the stronghold, and the strike force turned their attention to the wall. "Plant charges," Marcus ordered, and demo packs were affixed to the ferrocrete in shaped patterns designed to blow a hole wide enough for men to pass through. The timer was set for 30 seconds, barely enough time to take cover, and Marcus pulled the strike force back as far as the corridor allowed. The explosion was smaller but no less effective, punching a ragged hole through the wall that opened onto the ruins beyond. Smoke and dust billowed through the breach, and Marcus led the way through, emerging into the ash-choked night air. Behind them, the stronghold burned, smoke rising in a column that would be visible for kilometers. Alarms blared, searchlights swept frantically, and from every direction came the sound of orcs mobilizing for pursuit. The strike force ran, abandoning stealth for speed, every man pushing through pain and exhaustion because stopping meant capture, and capture meant death. They covered 2 kilometers before the first pursuit caught up, a mob of orcs on crude bikes that screamed across the wasteland with engines that belched fire. Marcus turned, braced, and opened fire, his lancer cutting down riders in controlled bursts. The Cadians added their las fire, and the Catachans threw grenades that transformed the pursuit into explosions of burning fuel and shrapnel. But more were coming. Always more. The strike force fragmented, squads breaking off to engage pursuers while the main body continued the retreat. Marcus saw men fall, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and there was nothing he could do to save them. The mission had been accomplished. The war boss was dead or crippled. The Orc horde would descend into infighting that would buy the Imperium precious time. The cost had been 47 lives. Marcus ran, carrying Vask over his shoulder despite his injured arm, Torvin beside him covering their retreat with disciplined bursts of las fire. Behind them, the stronghold collapsed completely, its structure finally giving way under the weight of damage, and a mushroom cloud of smoke rose into the sky. They reached Imperial lines at dawn, stumbling through the wire and falling into trenches manned by soldiers who stared at them as though they were ghosts. Commissar Colt was waiting, his greatcoat immaculate, his expression unreadable. He counted the survivors, noted the casualties, and nodded once. "The war boss is dead," Colt stated. It was not a question. "Buried under 1,000 tons of rubble," Marcus confirmed, his voice raw. "The stronghold is destroyed. The horde will be in disarray for days, maybe weeks. Then you have bought us time. The evacuation transports will arrive within 48 hours. We will hold the line until then, and when the last civilian is off-world, we will abandon this planet to the Orcs. Hellsreach Minor is lost, but its people will survive." Marcus said nothing, too exhausted to process the magnitude of what Colt had just revealed. The Commissar had gone against Munitorum orders, had prioritized civilians over military doctrine, had committed what some would call heresy. And yet, standing in the trench surrounded by exhausted soldiers who had given everything, it seemed like the only decision that mattered. Colt stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone meant only for Marcus. "You fought well, Sergeant Fenix. You have saved lives today, more than you will ever know. The Emperor may not care, but I do, and so will the people we evacuate from this hell." He extended a hand, a gesture of respect that transcended rank and culture. Marcus shook it, feeling the strength in the Commissar's grip, the sincerity behind the words. "Get some rest," Colt said. "You've earned it. We'll need you again when the Orcs regroup, but for now, rest." Marcus found a section of trench wall that was relatively clean and collapsed against it, his armor powering down to conserve energy, his weapons secure. Around him, the surviving members of the strike force did the same, each man processing the mission in his own way, dealing with loss and pain and the grim satisfaction of having accomplished the impossible. Torvin settled beside Marcus, his chainsword across his knees, his face lined with exhaustion that went beyond physical. "We did it," he said quietly. "We actually did it." "Yeah," Marcus replied. "We did. Was it worth it? All those men we lost?" Marcus considered the question, weighing lives against outcomes, individual deaths against collective survival. It was a calculation he had made too many times, one that never got easier no matter how often he ran the numbers. "Ask me when the transports arrive," Marcus said finally. "When we see civilians boarding ships instead of dying in trenches, then I'll tell you if it was worth it." Torvin nodded, accepting the answer, and silence fell between them. The sun rose over Hellsreach Minor, or what passed for a sun through the ash and smoke. The light was weak, grey, but it was light nonetheless. And for a brief moment, the artillery fell silent, and the battlefield held its breath. Marcus closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull him under, and for the first time since arriving on this world, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, some of them would live to see tomorrow. The transports arrived 36 hours later, massive bulk carriers that descended through the ash-choked atmosphere with the grace of falling mountains. They landed in designated zones behind the Imperial lines, their ramps deploying to disgorge cargo containers and take on refugees. The evacuation was organized chaos, civilians streaming from underground shelters and ruined hab blocks, carrying what few possessions they could salvage. Guardsmen directed the flow, maintaining order through discipline and the occasional threat of violence when panic threatened to overwhelm organization. Marcus stood guard at one of the evacuation points, his lancer held ready, his armor patched with field repairs that left it more scar tissue than original plate. He had refused medical treatment beyond basic wound closure, insisting that others needed the Medicae's attention more. His arms still ached, his head throbbed from the concussion he had sustained in the stronghold collapse, but he remained functional, and that was all that mattered. He watched families board the transports, mothers clutching children who had never known anything but war, elderly men and women who moved with the shuffling gait of those who had lost everything multiple times. They cast fearful glances at the horizon, where smoke still rose from ongoing battles, where the Orc horde continued its inexorable advance despite the loss of its warboss. The strike force had bought time, not victory. The distinction was crucial. A child approached Marcus, a girl no more than 8 years old, her face smudged with ash, her eyes too large for her malnourished frame. She stared up at him, taking in his foreign armor and unfamiliar weapons, and then spoke in hesitant Gothic. "Are you an angel?" "The priests say the Emperor sends angels to protect us." Marcus knelt, bringing himself to her eye level, and shook his head gently. "No, just a soldier, but I'll make sure you get on that transport safely." The girl considered this, then reached out and touched his armor, her small hand resting against the scarred plate. "Thank you, soldier." She was pulled away by her mother, a haggard woman who offered Marcus a brief nod of gratitude before hurrying toward the transport. Marcus watched them disappear up the ramp, joining thousands of others fleeing a world that had become uninhabitable. Torvin appeared beside him, his uniform replaced with a fresh set that made him look almost human again. "That's the last of the civilians from Sector 7. Command estimates, we've evacuated 60,000 in total. Not everyone, but more than would have survived otherwise." "How much time do we have?" Marcus asked. "Transports depart in 6 hours, then we hold the line for another 12 while the rear guard collapses. After that, we're on the last transport out, assuming we survive that long." Marcus nodded, the calculation familiar. Rearguard actions were always bloody, always desperate, but necessary to ensure the evacuation succeeded. He had participated in enough of them to know the pattern: hold as long as possible, trade lives for time, withdraw in stages until there was nowhere left to withdraw to. An explosion lit up the northern horizon, close enough to feel the shockwave, and alarms began blaring across the evacuation zone. Vox chatter erupted, officers shouting orders, and Marcus's combat instincts snapped back into focus. "Orcs," Torvin said unnecessarily, his hand moving to his chainsword. "They're pushing harder than expected. The northern line is collapsing." Marcus keyed his Vox to command frequency, listening to the panicked reports flooding in. The Orc horde had reorganized faster than intelligence predicted, new leaders emerging from the power vacuum left by the warboss's death. They were attacking in greater numbers, with renewed fury, as though the destruction of their stronghold had enraged rather than scattered them. Commissar Kult's voice cut through the chaos, calm and authoritative. "All units, hold your positions. The evacuation will not be compromised. Reinforcements are being redirected to the northern sectors. If any man abandons his post, I will execute him personally." The threat was not empty, and the Vox chatter stabilized as discipline reasserted itself. Marcus turned to Torvin. "Get back to Sigma 7. I'm going to the northern line. They'll need every weapon they can get." Torvin grabbed his arm, his grip tight. "You've done enough. You're one man. You can't hold a collapsing front. I can buy them time to evacuate the civilians nearest to the breach. That's enough. You'll die, maybe, but I've been dying for years. At least here, it'll mean something." Torvin held his gaze for a long moment, then released his arm and stepped back. "Emperor watch over you, Fenix. You're a stubborn bastard, "But you're our bastard." Marcus allowed himself a brief smile, then turned and ran toward the sound of battle. The northern line was hell made manifest, trenches overwhelmed by green tides that seemed infinite. Guardsmen fought with desperate ferocity, las fire lighting up the smoke, heavy weapons hammering at orcs that refused to die. Officers bellowed orders that were drowned out by explosions and roaring. Medicae personnel worked frantically to stabilize the wounded, knowing that evacuation was impossible and triage meant deciding who lived long enough to bleed out. Marcus arrived to find a section of trench under imminent collapse. 30 guardsmen holding against 200 orcs in a fight that could only end one way. He did not hesitate. He vaulted into the trench, his lancer raised, and opened fire. The weapon roared, its muzzle flash strobing through the chaos, and orcs fell in stuttering lines. Marcus advanced, firing on the move, his armor taking hits that would have killed unarmored men. Warnings flashed across his HUD, power reserves critical, ammunition running low, structural damage mounting. He ignored them all and kept firing because stopping meant the line broke and the evacuation failed. A massive orc knob charged him, wielding a weapon that looked like a chainsaw welded to a cannon. Marcus met the charge head-on, activating his chainsaw bayonet and driving it into the knob's midsection. The impact staggered them both, and they grappled, strength against strength, Marcus's armor servos screaming as they fought to match the orc's brute power. The knob headbutted him, and his visor cracked, blood spraying across the inside. Marcus drove his knee into the orc's groin, a move born from desperation rather than technique, and when it doubled over, he ripped the chainsaw blade upward through its torso. The knob collapsed, and Marcus kicked it aside, turning to face the next threat. The battle raged for 2 hours, a brutal grind that consumed men and orcs alike. Marcus fought until his lancer clicked empty, transitioned to his sidearm until it jammed, then drew his combat knife and fought hand to hand. His armor was a wreck, plates torn away, systems failing, but he stayed on his feet because falling meant dying, and dying meant failing. Reinforcements arrived in the form of a Lehman Russ battle tank, its turret swiveling to pour fire into the orc horde. The heavy bolter sponsons added their fury, and the tide finally broke, greenskins retreating under fire that tore them apart. The guardsmen cheered, a ragged sound of relief and exhaustion, and Marcus allowed himself to collapse against the trench wall. A familiar voice spoke from behind him. "You have a disturbing tendency to throw yourself into hopeless situations, Sergeant Fenix." Marcus turned to find Commissar Colt standing in the trench, his bolt pistol holstered, his greatcoat somehow still pristine. The man was an enigma, seemingly immune to the chaos that consumed everyone around him. "Someone has to," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse. Colt studied him with an expression that might have been respect or curiosity. "The evacuation is complete. All civilians who could be saved have been loaded onto transports. The fleet will depart in 1 hour. We have been ordered to withdraw to the final defensive line and hold until the last transport can lift off. How many transports are left?" 3. Enough for the surviving guardsmen. Barely. Marcus processed the numbers, understanding immediately that not everyone would make it. The rear guard would be slaughtered holding the line, buying time for others to escape. It was the same calculation, played out on a larger scale. "I'll stay with the rear guard," Marcus said. Colt shook his head. "You have done enough. You have earned evacuation. The Emperor himself could not demand more from you." "I'm not doing it for the Emperor," Marcus said quietly. "I'm doing it because it's right." For the first time since Marcus had met him, Commissar Colt smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible, but genuine. "Then you understand what it means to serve. Not faith, not duty, but the simple recognition that some things are worth dying for." He extended his hand again, and Marcus shook it. "It has been an honor, Sergeant Marcus Fenix. May we meet again in this life or the next." Kalt turned and walked away, his greatcoat billowing, and Marcus was left alone in the trench with the wounded and the dying. The final hours were a blur of fighting and withdrawal, the guard collapsing inward toward the landing zones in a fighting retreat that left corpses scattered across every meter. Marcus fought alongside men whose names he never learned, held lines that were already lost, and watched transports lift off one by one until only a single ship remained. The orcs sensed victory and pressed harder, their numbers seemingly infinite, their fury undiminished by casualties. The final defensive perimeter shrank to 100 meters, then 50, then 20. Guardsmen fell by the dozens, overwhelmed by sheer mass, and the remaining soldiers prepared for a last stand that would end in annihilation. Marcus stood at the center of the line, his lancer empty but still clutched in his hands, his armor a ruin held together by prayer and desperation. Around him, 30 guardsmen fixed bayonets and prepared to charge, choosing to die on their feet rather than on their knees. And then, through the smoke and fire, a voice crackled over the vox. Transport lifting off in 30 seconds. All personnel within range, board now. This is the last chance. Repeat. Last chance. The guardsmen looked at each other, understanding dawning, and as one they broke from the line and ran. Marcus ran with them, his legs barely responding, his armor's power reserves finally giving out. He felt himself slow, his steps becoming heavier, and knew he would not make it. Hands grabbed him from both sides, Torven and Vask lifting him bodily and dragging him forward. They crashed through the transport's open ramp as orcs swarmed the landing zone, bullets pinging off the hull, and the ship's engines roared to life. The ramp closed, cutting off the chaos outside, and the transport lifted with gut-wrenching acceleration. Marcus lay on the deck, gasping for breath, surrounded by exhausted soldiers who stared at nothing with the 1,000-yard gaze of men who had seen too much. Torven collapsed beside him, his face pale with blood loss from a wound Marcus had not noticed. "We made it. Emperor's grace, we actually made it." Marcus said nothing, too tired to speak, and let the darkness take him. The medbay of the transport was a cramped space filled with wounded soldiers and overworked Medicae personnel. Marcus woke to find himself on a cot, his armor removed, his injuries cleaned and bandaged with efficiency that spoke of long practice. His left arm was in a sling, the shoulder stabilized with metal braces that would require surgery to remove. His head was wrapped in gauze, and his body ached with a comprehensive pain that suggested multiple fractures and internal injuries. He was alive. Around him, other soldiers lay in various states of recovery, some sleeping, others staring at the ceiling with expressions that suggested they were replaying battles in their minds. The Medicae moved between cots, checking vitals, administering pain medication, offering words of comfort that were practiced and sincere. Torven appeared, limping on a crutch, his own injuries visible beneath his medical gown. He settled onto the cot next to Marcus with a grunt of pain. "Medicae says you'll recover," Torven said. "Might take a few months, but you'll be combat ready again. Whether you want to be is another question." "Where are we going?" Marcus asked. "Staging area on Cipramundi. From there, the regiment will be reassigned to whatever front needs bodies. The usual Imperial logistics. You'll be given a choice. Stay with the Guard or request reassignment. Given what you've done, Command will probably honor any reasonable request." Marcus considered the implications. He was officially part of the Imperial Guard now, a soldier in an empire he barely understood, fighting wars for causes he did not believe in. But he had nowhere else to go. No home to return to. No friends or family waiting for him. The Guard was the only structure he had, the only purpose. It was enough. "I'll stay," Marcus said. "Where else would I go?" Torven nodded, as though he had expected the answer. "Commissar Kalt put you in for a commendation, said you saved more lives on Hellsreach Minor than any 3 regiments combined. That's high praise from a man who executes soldiers for cowardice." Cult is a good man, Marcus said quietly, cares about his soldiers in a way that most officers don't. Agreed. Which is why I'm staying with his command. He's requested that those of us who survived be kept together as a veteran squad. Figured you'd want to know. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Yeah, I'd like that. They sat in companionable silence. Two soldiers who had survived hell together, bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Outside the viewport, stars drifted past in slow procession, thousands of points of light that represented worlds Marcus would never see, battles he would never fight, lives he would never touch. But for now, he was alive. He had survived.